take a bit of a cleanse away from Prismatic, I decided to go back and look on some older subclasses, and I've kind of discovered that a lot of exotics have actually been updated so they work on Prismatic, making Arc Warlock completely dead in the water. I've always had to believe that Arc Warlock was the most lacking of the Warlock subclasses. It is overshadowed by the light subclasses and the dark subclasses, and now that Prismatic is here, I think it's even more than it ever was before. When it comes to exotic exclusivity, it only has one exotic that exclusively only works on a pure arc, which is Geomag Stabilizers, purely because Chaos Reach is not on Prismatic. However, any other exotic, they work perfectly fine, and in some cases work even better purely because they're not tied to the arc subclass, which is what makes most of these exotics not that strong long term, because they are tied to a subclass that isn't objectively good. And I quite honestly don't wish for this to be the case. I think arc would be a pretty fun subclass if it were to receive the buffs that it needs to. Before we talk about subclasses more, we need to talk about Prismatic. Prismatic Warlock is, I want to say, the weakest of the three. I don't think it has absurdly powerful supers. You could argue that Nova Bomb is good, however, it could be obstructive to your teammates. It is really good for solo content. Song of Flame is typically the best one to use in a team setting, as it is less destructive against your teammates and isn't as reliant on its mono version to perform at its peak, similarly to Nova Bomb. So why is Prismatic Warlock so strong that I think it completely kills Arc? First things first is Lightning Surge is objectively stronger on a Prismatic Warlock than it is on Arc, which is a bit strange. First things first, this has more fragment slots on Prismatic than it does even on Arc, which is a bit confusing. It's honestly a little bit sad for the current state of Arc, and you could make the argument, well, what if we just match it? Let's give Lightning Surge another fragment slot, which is sure a good idea, but I think there's a lot more that needs to happen to Arc than just giving it more fragment slots to make it better. A benefit of using a Lightning Surge on Prismatic is that you can also use it with Feed the Void, which in my opinion is probably a top 5 aspect in the game, and it is given to Prismatic Warlock, which essentially makes any other aspect good, because as long as you're using any of these, you're proccing Feed the Void. In fact, as long as you just have one ability and that ability is able to land a kill, and this includes your super, you are effectively immortal as long as you can keep killing things. And on top of that, you get extra grenade energy. There is no downside to Feed the Void. It is, personally, I think it is what makes Prismatic Warlock what it is. Without this, I think if Child of the Old Gods or if Chaos Accelerants were here, I think Prismatic Warlock would not be as popular as it is right now. This is what carries Prismatic Warlock. Do I think it needs a nerf? No, but I do think the mono subclasses need a buff and they need some tuning to be able to have more longevity in the game. I think it is important that the other subclasses do receive love. I don't think Prismatic needs any more fragments. I don't think it needs any more aspects. I don't think it needs any changes. I think as it is right now, it is nearly perfect. And I think with time, when we get more exotics, it's just going to become better. But I think the mono subclasses need to become even better than Prismatic. But that's just my opinion. Whenever something is underperforming, the typical response is to just buff its damage. While that is objectively going to make it more viable and a lot more people are more likely to use it, I do find it to be a bit lazy. I've never seen Stormcaller as a DPS class, nor do I think that is the push that it should be going towards in the future. However, I think what we need to buff is what it is trying to do, but it doesn't really fully grasp you. For example, Lightning Surge is objectively better on Prismatic because you have more melees with an Arcane Needle, as well as having more fragment slots. And while it would be easy to just say, let's give him more fragment slots, I don't think that's really what this aspect is asking for. Instead, I think this should give you an additional melee charge. And people may be a bit hesitant to say that because, well, now on Prismatic, it'll have 4 melee charges and this will have 2. However, that doesn't need to necessarily be the case. For example, Void Hunter and Prismatic Hunter both share a aspect that function completely different depending on if you're playing on Void or Prismatic. That is Stylus Executioner. Stylus Executioner only works with Void debuffs when you're on a Void subclass and works with all debuffs when you're on a Prismatic subclass. I feel like the same thing could apply to Lightning Surge. However, I cannot speak in absolutes because I do not know how the game's coding necessarily works. I think it's pretty important that I state that pretty early on. These are purely ideas that I have. I have quite literally zero experience in any aspects of what it takes to make a game, how these things can work. And I'm purely just thinking and saying it to y'all. If Bungie gave me access to their code and said, hey, go ham, I could quite literally do nothing to improve the game. With that disclaimer out the way, let's continue being an armchair dev. Onto the second aspect, we just talked about lightning surge. We're going to talk about aerostatic mine. Wow, this is the best of the three, arguably might be second place. I think it is quite bad, which is odd to say. And it's not bad because it doesn't do anything or it has downsides. I think it's bad because it does what fragments do, or it does what the base class already does. Let me explain. So defeating targets with arc abilities or defeating blinded or jolted targets creates an ionic trace. That's good. However, that already exists in Spark of Ions. Now you can use both of these together, which will result in more ionic traces. However, I don't think this is strong enough to be an aspect on its own, which is why there's the second part. Collecting an ionic trace makes you amplified. However, as you can read on the right side of the screen, it says rapidly defeating targets with arc damage makes you amplified. So what's really the purpose of this? I mean, its strongest use case is in PvP because you can't get rapid arc kills very easily in PvP. It might be a bit more difficult. So that's where it's at its strongest. In PvE, this is at its strongest when you're not playing the class as efficiently as you should be. Like if you're only getting one ionic trace every 15 seconds, I don't think you're playing the class a proper way it should be played. I think you should be getting ionic traces like snap, 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 ionic trace, and it's like a constant flow, right? So why would getting amplified from an ionic trace be a selling point for this? I don't think it is. So what I thought about doing is, why not change collecting ionic trace makes you amplified into collecting ionic trace grants you health and starts health regeneration. Now this massively makes this a top pick on Arc Warlock. It solves so many issues that Arc Warlock has because you don't have any form of survivability, and if you want to have a form of survivability, it requires you to do one of two things. It requires you to put Buried Bloodline in your energy slot, which now takes your exotic slot, or it requires you to pick up Recuperation or Better Already, which then takes away your ability to put in a Surge mod, which then affects your ability to do damage, which Arc Warlock already is lacking in damage. So is it really worth the sacrifice of losing out on more damage purely so you can survive a little bit more? I quite honestly don't think so. Specifically for Arc Warlock, I don't think it's worth losing out your ability to do more damage purely so you can survive just slightly a bit more. Nearly every other subclass in the game has some form of health regeneration that is meaningful. I think Arc Warlock needs to get it in the form of Aerostatic Mine. And let's say you give it to Aerostatic Mine, that could buff Fallen Sunstar to be an even better exotic on Arc, to where nearby allies also gain ability energy and health regeneration when you collect an ionic trace. That would make this on par. I don't know about on par, but it would make it just like Speaker's Helm for some players and make it a bit more viable, and it will give a sort of alternative to the playstyle that Speaker's Sight has. Speaking of a supportive playstyle, let's talk about the final aspect, aka Arc Souls. Arc Souls actually happen to be my favorite of the Stormcaller aspects. It's just good. However, I think it could be better. You see, Arc Souls are great. They provide support with your allies. They are beneficial with your allies. And I don't think they're bad in solo play either. In fact, I think they're quite good in solo play. You could make the argument to just use Getaway Artist and throw on Lightning Surge if you're going to play solo, which I would most of the time agree with. However, Arc Souls in team content can be a bit lacking if your teammates can't get amplified. See, Arc Souls are best when you're amplified. They get supercharged. They are in their best state when you're amplified. That's just that simple. So when your allies aren't amplified, they're getting a portion of your Arc Soul at its maximum capabilities. And I think that kind of blows. I'm gonna be real, I think it blows. So if it is possible, I think if you cast your Rift while you're amplified, if your allies pick up an Arc Soul while yours is currently supercharged, theirs should also be supercharged. In my opinion, that makes sense. Posted at Cowb, I'm gonna double it and say, let's give this one more fragment slot as well. Okay, I've talked a lot about the aspects and I didn't really talk about the fragments. I don't think the fragments mean much changing. The only one I could really see like getting a buff that is, I guess, somewhat like needed. Quite honestly, I don't think there's. I think maybe Spark of Volts get a buff. I think if this jolted enemies would be more compelling to pick up, but outside of that, they're pretty good. Maybe give Spark Resistance more DR while you're amplified, or while you're amplified, you should get the Spark of Resistance effect while you have this equipped. I don't know. That's a bit debatable. However, what I really want to talk about is a potential exotic for Arc Warlocks. You see, I think Ball Lightning is pretty underutilized on Arc Warlock. I don't think it really provides too much to the Arc Warlock kits. And I came up with an exotic design that I want to throw at you guys. So essentially, you have Ball Lightning on. So what this exotic does is it gives you an extra melee charge of Ball Lightning. And if hypothetically we give Lightning Surge a third charge or a second charge, you can have 3 Ball Lightnings. That on its own is pretty cool. So now you can have a Lightning Surge build with 3 melees on Stormcaller if you wanted to. But I don't think that's like going to be the main seller. When you cast Ball Lightning, you summon a Storm Grenade at its impact site. So this is what we have so far. Extra melee, summon Storm Grenade at the location of your Ball Lightning. Storm Grenade kills, give you melee energy. Now you have a feedback loop. That's based on the idea that I've had for a while. This really comes down to, I believe, Shock and Awe is the artifact mod. Like every once in a while, Bungie will drop that, and it's just when you get arc kills, you basically summon a little arc storm at that location. I think it'd be really cool, especially if you were to give it to Warlocks as an exotic. Now, what type of synergy could you do with that? Well, you can make it to where Magnitude, Shock, those two will just buff your Storm Grenade, right? We have those. Throw in Ions. Now you get more ability energy. And I think that's really it. Let's see. I guess you can do your melee attacks, give you more reload and stability for a short duration if you're focusing on melee. We could do Amplitude since you're going to be amplified. I guess you could do that. But like, that's like the main seller. Is like you throw out a Ball Lightning and it basically summons a Storm Grenade. That Storm Grenade now can be affected by these. And now you have this loop. I think it'd be a pretty cool loop. You're just like, I don't know, a Storm Caller. Get it? That's the whole idea around the exotic. You call storms. Like, am I crazy for thinking of this? I feel like this would have been made by now, you know? Anyway, that's all I have to say about Stormcaller. Let me know what your guys' thoughts are in the comments. Please tell me that I'm wrong if you believe that I'm wrong. Peace out, y'all.